alive. Oh, it's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive.
Then give me just a moment, just one moment to demonstrate my theory. I can prove this man's alive.
Sir Francis Stevens and the great Dr. Binet from the University of Paris. What do they know? What will they ever know? I'll take them somewhere they've never been. Back into time. It'll work well tonight. I'm sure and I'm ready. They'll never laugh at me again.
My only thought was to keep him alive, I swear it. But when I saw signs of the gradual awakening of the canon brain, I knew I'd made a great discovery for science.
You must understand that once my mind is made up, you will not change it. Perhaps I can do it for you.
What's the meaning of this?
A new experiment, and you will be the subject of it.
Let me go!
Hello, and welcome to every single sci-fi film ever. I'm Aisha Khan. Today we'll be talking about mad scientists. Generally, but also kind of specifically, because in the 1930s and early 40s, the number of films about mad scientists is insane. After 1931's Frankenstein, featuring Boris Karloff as the monster, multiple films were made with the mad scientist trope. Boris Karloff himself went on to make so many of these films, including The Invisible Ray, The Man Who Changed His Mind, The Man They Could Not Hang, The Man with Nine Lives, Before I Hang, Black Friday, The Ape, The Devil Commands, and this isn't even all of them. Some of them are very much sci-fi. There's usually a heavy crossover with horror, and then some of them are pure horror films. Aside from the Boris Karloff films, there are many more, including Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, one in 1931, one in 1941, The Island of Lost Souls, Dr. Cyclops, Dr. X, The Crime of Dr. Crespi, The Devil Bat, Man-Made Monster, The Mad Doctor of Market Street, and that's not including the ones we've already covered, which include Metropolis and Frankenstein and the Invisible Man. So, today I have two absolutely wonderful guests joining me. First up, we have Thomas Doherty, who is a professor of American Studies at Brandeis University. He's a cultural historian with a special interest in Hollywood cinema, which he has written extensively about. Welcome to the show, Thomas. How are you?
I'm doing fine, and thanks for the invitation.
Joining Thomas, we have Xavier Aldana Reyes, who is a reader of English literature and film at the Manchester Metropolitan University and has a special interest in the Gothic. His books include the fiction anthology Promethean Horrors, Classic Tales of Mad Science. Welcome to the show, Xavier. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much, both of you, for coming on. I wanted to start with Thomas. If you could tell us a bit about the beginning of the 1930s, what are we heading into a decade of in terms of the USA and Hollywood at this time?
Well, they both connect pretty well. 1930, of course, is the first year of the Great Depression. And it's also the first year that the Hollywood studios convert to sound 100%. So I think you can make a pretty good argument that just as the calendar turns the page into 1930, with the onset of the Great Depression, started, of course, by the stock market crash of October 1929, we're really entering a new era in both American culture and in Hollywood cinema. The other thing going on in 1930, of course, is the acceptance of something called the Production Code. Now, the Production Code is a list of commandments that Hollywood cinema must abide by. It's a very elaborate document. It was written by a Roman Catholic priest and a devout Roman Catholic layman named Martin Quigley. The priest's name is Daniel A. Lord, which is a great name for a Jesuit priest, Father Lord. And unlike most attempts at censorship in Hollywood, in America before 1930, which were basically a list of do's and don'ts. They told you what not to do and what wasn't permissible on the screen. The Production Code was actually a moral philosophy because Catholics had been censoring art since, basically the time of Christ and beyond. So they really knew what they were doing philosophically. So the code has this very interesting preamble, which says things that I think even today most people would agree with, which is art has effect on society, that it's incumbent upon us to take our art seriously, and especially to have art that will not adversely affect children. Now, it's an elaborate set of philosophies and a set of commandments of what you can't do and what you should do. The moguls, the Hollywood studio system, ignores it for 4 years. And this is known in film history as the pre-code era, from 1930 to 1934. And then in 1934, there's actually an agency set up under the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America called the Production Code Administration. It's run by a really stern Irish Catholic guy named Joseph Breen. And for basically the next 20 years under Joe Breen, everything actually abides by those commandments, at least on the surface. Now, underneath the surface, and this is why science fiction and horror is so fascinating, even under the production code, there are all kinds of weird stuff rumbling underneath. So those two things, I think, in a synoptic form, are what's going on in the 1930s, that you have the onset of the horror, the economic horror of the Great Depression, which sometimes gets reflected quite explicitly in some of the horrific films of the 1930s.
It is interesting because we've touched upon the pre-code and the post-code eras before, but I didn't realize it had such a strong kind of religious backing behind it. Okay, so mad scientists have been around for a while, and we'll get to that. But can you explain the sudden increase, like the number of films about mad scientists in the 1930s? They proliferate like crazy. What was behind that?
Well, one of the things going on in the 1930s, of course, is this great reevaluation of the Great War, which the minute the Great War is over, the mindless slaughter of 20 million people, that all the cultures of the world start having a more dubious attitude to science. In the 19th century, science, the age of the Enlightenment, produced antiseptic surgery and pasteurization and all these things that made our life better. And before the Great War, we thought that science was going to be a technological marvel that could only improve our life. But of course, with the Great War, we saw that science was also devoting itself to poison gas, ballistics, aerial warfare, bigger and better ways of exterminating human beings. And that's why so many of the films will have this really wacko creature who is using the tools of science to do really underhanded and dangerous things.
Thank you for that. Very interesting. And I think once, the 1930s begin and the success of Frankenstein and then The Invisible Man, I suppose that just causes a kind of a snowball effect.
Right, because Hollywood's always going to imitate something that's successful. And so when films like Dracula, who's not a scientist, and Frankenstein in 1932 come out, you have that proliferation of characters who conveniently enough are part of public domain narratives. So Mary Shelley is not going to sue Universal for the rights to Frankenstein. So this is another reason to have these creatures from the 19th century reemerge in the 1930s.
Thank you. And you talk about Mary Shelley. So when I was doing my research, I had an inkling that perhaps Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, was the origin of the mad scientist. But when I spoke to you earlier, Xavier, you suggested that although that is one of the prototypes, that there were other origins. Can you talk about where this all began? Yes,
it's of course a long and complicated history, and it depends on how far back you want to, wind back the clock. I think it was Arthur C. Clarke that said that any form of sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, right? And I think we see obviously that working out in cinema. We'll talk about this quickly enough. Before we get the mad scientist, we get the crazy alchemist in a very similar looking laboratory to the one, full of the bric-a-brac that Frankenstein would have. But of course, going back in literary history, we have to remember as well, we like to think that Frankenstein was the origin of the mad scientist, but the word scientist itself wasn't really coined until the 1830s. A little bit later. He's just a student of natural philosophy, I believe, in Mary Shelley's novel. The figure of the alchemist, which goes back to at least Faust and the legend of Faust, is a really interesting one because it already contains all of the elements that we would see play out in the mad scientist. This reaching out for some kind of forbidden knowledge, forbidden law, and this tension between wanting to know and sort of the godliness of it all, which goes back again to the myth of Prometheus stealing the fire from the gods. I'm sure this is something we'll pick up again, but there's this kind of tension between wanting to reach beyond the limits of the human and into something perhaps divine, seems to me to be at the heart of a lot of this. But even in Gothic literature, there are examples of alchemists in the early 19th century. The work of Percy Shelley, for example, in St. Irvyne, William Godwin in St. Leon in 1799. What's the other one that's escaping me? Byron's Manfred from 1817. All of those have alchemical-like figures that do a very similar thing, and it probably all starts to gel in thanks to Goethe's Faust. And again, that kind of like vision. And before him, of course, Dr. Faustus by Christopher Marlowe, which already sort of created this notion of melancholia, I guess, around the notion of the alchemist. So yeah, a very, very long history. But I think where it starts to take shape for cinema specifically is through the so-called cinema of attractions of the early 1900s, the work of Georges Méliès. It is fair to say that some of his alchemists are just charlatans, but also they become indistinguishable from magicians. And of course, the fact that he himself was a magician and used cinema as a bit of an optical illusion stage binds all of these things together: science, technology, magic.
Interesting. I wanted to go on to the idea of the male scientist. I've actually been having a few discussions online, and someone I was chatting to on YouTube was saying, are there any female scientists? And I'd already spoken to Thomas about this. So I can have both of your inputs. I just wanted to point out what I found so far is Poison Ivy from Batman. I remember there's a mad scientist in 12 Monkeys, one of the kind of many in that. And then the lovely YouTube viewer that I was speaking to came up with Doc Ock from the new Spider-Verse films and Pearl from Mystery Science Theatre 3000, which I hate to admit I haven't seen because I grew up in the UK and it wasn't a thing there. And then I've also squeezed in Harley Quinn, who is a mad psychologist. Kind of close. But I did find a full extensive list, which is actually made by Jess Nevins, who was a guest on the show on the Pulps and Comics episode. So I'm going to add that onto the full show notes, which are on the website, if anyone wants to check it out. But let's go to Thomas first. Why are men more prominent when it comes to the mad scientist?
Well, science is the definitive kind of rational enterprise, and men historically and traditionally have been considered the more rational gender. Women are emotional, men are rational. So I think, the old-fashioned sexism probably explains 90% of it. Also the sense that women already have a creative outlet. They can reproduce. But the only way that a man can make life, Dr. Frankenstein found out, is by actually artificially and scientifically creating it. And so he kind of has an impulse that is already satisfied in the female. And I do think that sort of gender divide works pretty well, that that the scientist's rationality usually goes a step too far. That there's nothing wrong with trying to create life, but when you start robbing graves and sewing people together and get the wrong brain from the lab, things can go a little awry. And for most of these mad scientists, what makes them mad is they kind of go 2 or 3 steps too far, right? That if they had just sort of dialed it back a little, they'd be a prestigious professor at a university. So it's a way of saying, as Aristotle said, that even rationality has its limits. And this is why these guys become so dangerous. And they're like the scientists of the Great War who, persuade themselves that devoting your chemical and medical expertise to something like methane gas that kills people is, actually a good way to use your scientific education.
Drawing on a much more recent example that shows the longevity of this stereotype, I completely agree with the idea that we have historically constructed men as brains, as the great minds of history, and that was literally the case eventually with Einstein. There would be a debate over what museum would end up keeping his brain. It had become this kind of metonym for him as a thinker. But it's there in Oppenheimer. That's a film that almost exclusively pushes women out. They're there completely just for to provide that kind of visceral, emotional element that he seems to lack. because his concern is again, as Tom was saying, to create something for mankind, so to speak. So it hasn't gone away. It might be a biopic, it might not be a mad scientist story, but it follows very many of those ideas. What I wanted to say is that I think also maybe one of the reasons we don't associate women with science so often, apart from the fact that they have been pushed out of history by not being allowed to do it, but we do have, female scientists. We shouldn't forget people like Caroline Herschel, the astronomer, or Elizabeth Davis Colley, who was the first woman to be to join the Royal College of Surgeons, for example. But we also forget that women have written science fiction stories for a very long time. In fact, one of the first proto science fiction stories, The Blazing World, was written by Margaret Cavendish, who was herself called Mad by Samuel Pepys at one point. So it's just, we forget these stories. Jane Webb wrote a fantastically interesting science fiction story straight after Frankenstein that got published in 1927 called The Mummy, which is a proper full-on sci-fi novel. Again, we don't tend to associate it with her, but they're there.
That's really interesting. Thank you for that. I wanted to kind of venture into religion now. One interesting thing I was reading online, that forbidden knowledge, the story of Adam and Eve, is also about forbidden knowledge. And that is definitely the woman who takes the apple from the tree and then is, punished with all kinds of things. But religion plays a really big part in these mad scientists. I just wanted to quote one of the films from Dr. Cyclops.
We can shape life, take it apart, put it together again, mold it like putty.
But what you are doing is mad. It is diabolic. You are tampering with powers reserved to God.
And I suppose that's the kind of essence of why these mad scientists end up punished.
Yeah, it's man presuming to take what is rightfully God's, which is a kind of divine knowledge. And we see throughout history, whether it's Prometheus or Atlas, other people getting punished for giving man information that is God's. So Eve in the Garden of Eden is the other example. But at the same time, we're presumptuous enough to press on, and we realize that when we do take what is God's and demystify the supernatural and make it natural and scientific, we gain something from that. It really does make a break when the age of the Enlightenment. And that's why Mary Shelley, who comes right at the beginning of that age, is such a fascinating character when she creates the mad scientists. And although, as Avi points out, there are some precursors to this, I think what this scientist has that the magicians don't have, like Merlin doesn't have, is that I can be an apprentice of Dr. Frankenstein, and I can create life the same way. Science is reproducible, and you can explain it to people. And at this time in world history in the West, people are actually experiencing the miraculous, but it's scientific. So Zavi's point about the Arthur C. Clarke quote is how advanced technologies seem magical, which is, I think, the way most of us respond to technology today. Like, my relationship with my microwave is utterly pagan. Fire god melts ice cream. That's basically the relationship I have. I couldn't begin to explain how it operates. And if it breaks down, all I can do is throw it away. But as the science becomes more advanced, it does really become like magic. But on the other hand, science is not magic. We know that if I had the proper education in microwave technology, I probably have a better grasp of what's actually going on. And that's why, if you want to mark the beginning of this figure, I mean, maybe Zavi has a different take on this. I really think that Mary Shelley, again, a female, who writes the great generative science fiction story, allegedly out of her own grief of not being able to do what the woman traditionally does, which is to create life out of herself. So she kind of has to go the male route to create life artificially, the way only a male can create life, which is by going outside herself and collecting body parts and, regenerating them with electricity, which is this thing that up until, like 30 years before, when Ben Franklin does his famous experiment with the kite and lightning had been something that was flung down by the gods. And then suddenly Ben Franklin says, no, it's this natural phenomenon. I can protect you against it. I can put up, lightning rods on ship towers and in church steeples. And God will never be again that frightening, because I can kind of now, figure out God and scam a way around him because of guys like Ben Franklin and all the great scientists of the 19th century.
Very interesting. Thank you. I wanted to talk to Xavier about, you mentioned brains. I think there's a lot of the stuff in these 1913 films, which is about brains and blood, and the idea that when you swap brains, which happens really often in these Boris Karloff films, or when you make a serum from blood, in older films like El Rowan, there's a child that is born from a prostitute and a hanged man, and so it makes them inherently bad. And you were talking about the concept of the clean and the dirty body to me. Can you expand a bit on that?
There's definitely an obsession with brains at this point in time, as we say, not just because we have come to metonymize the scientist as a brain, but also because there were things going on scientifically at the time. I think around 1908 was some of the first tests with dogs where they were trying to graft, heads of dogs to other dogs and so on. So it was definitely something that would have been in the air, so to speak. But I also think it's important to remember the eugenics context in which a lot of this talk around the so-called abnormal brain, as we get in Frankenstein, was happening. Phrenology, of course, was something that develops in the 19th century strongly, but it doesn't really go away. And I think it's something that we need to, we like to think that that's something that's in the past by the 1930s, but, certain, and that we connect later to Germany very specifically and the Nazi period. But this was still in some way going on in the States up until the 1970s. There were miscegenation rules in the 1920s. For example, there were ongoing anti-Chinese immigration rules very strongly, which manifest in a lot of yellow peril stories in the States. The Fu Manchu films, MP Shields' work as well, which is kind of again on the cusp of like gothic and mad science and science fiction. It is full of those kind of like types of racism, I guess. So we shouldn't forget that it's not something that gets left behind, and that up until the 1970s we still have enforced sterilization in the United States of people we would now call neurodivergent or disabled.
That's also part of the code, isn't it, Thomas, that you can't show interracial relationships?
Yeah, in 1934, the so-called miscegenation clause of the production code starts to be rigorously enforced against especially black-white and white-Asian kind of relationships. So though there are kind of some exceptions to that, it wasn't enforced rigorously. And interestingly, the Roman Catholics who wrote the code thought the clause was un-Christian and outrageous. And it was put in not by the Catholics who wrote the code, but by Will Hayes, who was head of the Motion Picture Association of America, in deference to Southern exhibitors who didn't want to see any kind of implication that the races were equal and that could therefore have love relationships. But as always, even under the code, you see under the surface, there are these relationships, this sort of the lure, the forbidden love that the white man would have for the Native American or for the Asian, and vice versa. So you can do things with close-ups and lighting and eyeline matches that you couldn't do in the narrative of the film. So sometimes the sexual attraction, especially in pre-code Hollywood cinema, between a white guy and an Asian gal is just unmistakable. What's really going on in the desire, or what's going on with, say, a white woman having an attraction to a lusty, very athletic-looking Native American type, with his shirt off. You can do it with eyeline matches, but you can't do it under the code.
Interesting. I just wanted to quickly mention, because there's two Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde films. One is 1931 and is definitely pre-code. And then the second one seems very much like a copy, but you can tell it's definitely post-code. And they're trying to make, they're trying to do it as close to kind of as sexy as possible, but it really can't compete with those kind of pre-code levels.
So the sexuality, which is, of course, what's at the heart of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the thing you have to hide, which is your lustful side, is always going to be more explicit in the pre-code version before the production code in 1934, when it starts to be enforced, comes down like a hammer on these kind of narratives. And they're very carefully regulated. But a clever filmmaker can kind of get around them with elliptical meaning, but not explicit meaning like you have in the 31 film.
So the mad scientist films either go down the horror route or the sci-fi route, and obviously there's a huge crossover there. Can you talk a bit about what kind of fears and anxieties are around, which both, I think, horror and sci-fi deal with, are around science and the scientist, which cause this kind of proliferation in both these genres?
I think one of the things going on is, I know Xavier's work speaks to this, is the love-hate relationship we have with technology. That technology is something that makes our life better, and we love it, but it's kind of inexplicable and scary, and we need an expert to explain the technology to us, right? So one of the things in terms of the production code that I think the mad scientist figure can do is the code had real restrictions on portraying religious and civil authority as being in the end upright. So if there's a corrupt mayor of a town, the governor of the state will be shown to be a honest individual. So most authority figures have to be upheld under the production code, but the scientist doesn't. He's an authority figure that we can actually portray in a crazy light in which we don't admire him, where he's seen as evil, and we have to defeat him at the end of the film.
Very interesting.
I think in some ways he becomes a projection of anti-authoritarian, anti-authority impulses, because we can, in the end, we can kind of go up to the castle and set him on fire.
Thomas is right there in terms of, I think it was Siegfried Kracauer that read sort of the rise of fascism into, going from Caligari to Hitler, pretty much. And although obviously his focus is more German cinema, I think all of these kind of mad scientist figures that essentially put their own personal beliefs and values, or their obsessions, really. We've talked about the Jekyll and Hyde stories. Those are stories about repressed desires that sort of come out, through the potion that he drinks. And they're all stories about men being punished for their pride, in some sense. This is the tension, going back to the idea of the tension between religion and science, right? The bit in Frankenstein that got cut out of the original reel, in the name of God, now I know what it feels like to be God. It's exactly that thing, isn't it? Of kind of wanting to exceed the limitations and sort of taking too much pride in the process of creation. So I think that there's an element of kind of like looking at this mad scientist and tracing the rise of fascism, and then it's kind of like logical conclusion with Hitler. But the other thing that I think is evident in that horror is the rise of psychology, or at that particular point in time, psychoanalysis very specifically. Again, to go back to the Jekyll and Hyde films that you mentioned, both of them, when Jekyll turns into Hyde, we have these wonderful cinematic moments where the camera gyrates and we start seeing their subconscious in cinematic images. And in the first one, we get one of the character's dreams of like men telling him things like indecent, disgusting at some point. In the second film, it's a similar scene, but he's actually driving a hearse that instead of horses, there's a couple of women that he fancies.
Wait a minute. Positively indecent.
Look where he did to me.
Your conduct was disgusting. It isn't done. It isn't done. Strangle. Indecent. And a man dying of thirst. Forget water. Disgusting.
And the mad scientist acts like the catalyst, as Tom was saying. He's sort of like the gateway to this technology that we don't understand. The excitement of the new, but also the scariness of the new, the idea that we might be replaced or destroyed by it.
Thank you for that. When I was reading about psychoanalysis, apparently the 1930s was the time when institutions of psychoanalysis were first established in the US, and that became more dominant as so many people fled kind of Nazi Germany and Europe during that time and came into the US. So it is quite an interesting undercurrent. And I really agree about those scenes in both films, but that kind of like, I think they get repeated in later films and Hitchcockian kind of cinema as well, which is very interesting.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's happening in the 30s, as Davi pointed out, is we're all kind of getting a psychological or psychology 101 course from Hollywood cinema and in popular culture too. So there's a very celebrated trial in America in the 1920s, the Leopold and Loeb case, in which a couple of very rich Chicagoans have read too much Nietzsche, and they decide to kill somebody just to see what it feels like. So they kill this 14-year-old boy. Terrible case, and they're the some of the most privileged people and brilliant. They've all graduated from college in their teens. Brilliant guys, and it was called at the time the trial of the century. And the lawyer, a guy named Clarence Darrow, very innovatively brings what at the time were called not psychologists, but alienist, which is a great word for a psychologist, to testify. And it's really the first major American trial in which sort of psychological motivations start replacing original sin as an explanation for what a murderer does. And remarkably, he gets them off. He gets them a life sentence rather than the death penalty that everybody in America wanted for these two guys. But in the course of the trial, there's a lot of discussion about, repressed desire, Oedipal complexes, repressed homosexuality. And so by the time the 30s comes along, we're kind of getting a lesson that, dreams matter, for example. So a lot of these films like Jekyll and Hyde have what can be interpreted as a dream sequence. And it's not just in horror films. There's you were talking about miscegenation earlier. There's a fascinating Frank Capra film called The Bitter Tea of General Yen from 1933, in which a woman has a kind of unrequited attraction to a Chinese warlord. And he's hitting on her relentlessly, but of course her virginal Anglo-American self is resisting him. But she has a dream at one point in the movie in which you see the two stereotypes of the Asian in the American imagination, Dr. Fu Manchu, basically from the Sax Rohmer films and books, and then also a more suave, attractive version of the Chinese warlord who she surrenders to. So that can happen in a dream because we know by that time that dreams are expressions of our unconscious desires. I always think the classic film is from the science fiction film, Forbidden Planet, where it's monsters from the id that are attacking, and so the force fields that are projections of our id that are going to kill us.
I just wanted to add that it's worth saying as well that the 1930s is when some of the notions of genre that we now use begin to sort of crystallize properly. We still, especially at the beginning of that decade, we see lots of adjectives used to describe these films, chillers, shockers, thrillers. This demarcation that we have between horror and science fiction is a lot more modern than we like to think, although we like to sort of trace things back to, say, the Gothic romance. It's always a process of looking backwards and reading meaning into these stories. A lot of the horror, the mad scientist films are horror stories, but many of them are not horrific at all. There are many of them that are, I'm thinking Black Fridays and noir, really, with the mad scientist in it.
Exactly. I remember, and also there's scenes where you get like these shadows and it's all crime driven and it's like it's sci-fi, but it's very, very much a noir, I feel.
I really like this period for that reason.
I was just going to say, that's such a bizarre movie. And if you guys can explain it to me, because I was just watching it the other night, and the brain transfer thing just is all wrong, because somehow one brain goes into another guy's body, but it's not really him, And I really thought the kind of whole brain topology of that movie struck me as a little odd. And
were you hoping for some real hard science fiction there, Thomas?
Well, the thing about these genres, and especially I think it's science fiction or horror, is that what I find interesting about them, and I think it actually distinguishes the good ones from the bad ones, is you can take a crazy wacko conceit, like I'm going to build a creature out of body parts, electrify him, and he'll come to life, right? Okay, I'll believe that. And I think most of us, for the pleasure of the narrative, will accept any conceit when we walk into the movie, right? But if it kind of then does things that are like totally unrealistic after this unrealistic conceit, the movie starts falling apart. And the science fiction horror example I always give when I teach this stuff is the difference between King Kong, which is a brilliant movie, a brilliant horror film, right? Which has a wonderful second act, which is if you posit the fact that there's a giant ape living with dinosaurs on an island, which I'll definitely believe for the pleasure of the text, but I will not believe that you want to kill him. The brilliant thing about King Kong is we want to bring him back to New York and commercially exploit him. You know? So the end of the second act, he says, I'm going to make you all a fortune. We'll all become millionaires, boys. Cut to Broadway, right? And the counterexample I give is a film called Iceman, which I think is horrid, because the conceit of Iceman is that in the Arctic, we discover a Neanderthal who has been frozen in ice for 50,000 years. He's rejuvenated, and we kind of, have the fish out of water. He discovers modern America. We discover the connections we have with Iceman. And then in the second act, the U.S. government decides it wants to kill Iceman. And I go, no, there's no way we would want to kill Iceman. We'd, give him commercial endorsements, a reality show. Like the second act doesn't work. And I think that always distinguishes what is kind of good horror and good science fiction from the stuff that isn't so good, that it takes this bizarre conceit at the beginning and then follows it through rationally to the end of the narrative. Sorry if I got off on the tangent.
No, I absolutely love that. But so you did not enjoy Black Friday, I take it, from the
Well, I had problem with the brain transplant. Like, I'll accept a brain transplant any day of the week, right? But I didn't understand how once you transplant the gangster's brain into the brain of the English professor, how it becomes both brains. Can you explain this, Xavier?
Are you a brain transplant expert, Xavier? By any chance?
This is where I raise my hands and say I'm not a scientist.
Anyway, that if you're going to do a brain transplant movie, I think you really got to do it correctly.
It's a shame because out of all the ones that I've seen in the last 2 to 3 weeks, it is one of my favorite ones.
But you liked it because of the lighting, not because of the narrative logic of brain transplants.
Yeah, I think I always look at a lot of these films, which, I don't know, there's something just so adorable about these films. Like, you have a brain transplant. This guy has the knowledge from his brain of this criminal of where this treasure is. I just love the kind of naivety of it. And I think that's also the thing about science fiction is when they don't know stuff, they'll be like, well, this will probably happen if we do a brain transplant. Do you know what I mean? Like, they don't know. And that's also like with the King Kong thing, like a lot of people now will say, well, that's not sci-fi. But back, when The Lost World was written, the idea of a place where things could evolve to be different was quite kind of conceivable. So yeah, I quite like the brain transplant and all the serum. Mad science, it's great. Okay.
Yeah.
So talking of changing science, there was probably quite a lot of science happening that was changing the way people see the world. So we have all types of things being discovered. We have Einstein coming to the US in 1933, who's just changed the whole, science world's concept of what we thought was real. So I imagine that might have some part to play in how people's perception of science changed during this period.
I think the impact of Einstein specifically cannot be underplayed. He didn't just familiarize people with the image of the scientist. He became the figure of the scientist, by the late 20th century. When he got the Nobel Prize in 1921, he still didn't have that distinctive look that he would develop in later life. But, we forget how many things have been inspired by his image. Yoda from Star Wars, the whole forehead look, that's Einstein. If I'm not mistaken, the eyes in E.T. were also inspired by Einstein's eyes. And I think certainly in the late 20th century, he became a a figure that even children would recognize. I think Christopher Frayling, in his book on mad scientists, goes through quite a few studies where children were asked to draw a scientist, and they very often draw a version of Einstein. So I think we can't underestimate how big his influence was, certainly in our picture of the scientist more generally, but specifically the mad scientist, as nice a man as he always proved to be. And finally, this idea that to be a genius, you don't have to be a very good student, which is something that has been passed on from Einstein, right? Famously, he was not a very good pupil at school, but he was a genius, right? He was misunderstood, which is part of the myth of the mad scientist.
And also the hair, I think, is quite important when it comes to Einstein.
And the hair is interesting, isn't it? Because it goes back to the idea of unruliness. There's an unruly brain under that scalp.
The other scientist, of course, is Edison. He's not a mad scientist, but he gets 2 biopics from MGM. And the Great Man biopic and the Great Woman biopic, because there's one about Madame Curie as well, was a real way to honor the good part of the scientist in our culture. If we have all these mad scientists on the one hand, we have these other mad scientists who are benefactors of mankind, who sacrifice mightily, like Louis Pasteur, or Dr. Ehrlich, or Edison, for the benefit of mankind. And there are people around who quite remember these scientists as somebody who directly affects our life. So there are an entire generation of Roman Catholics of my generation who would light candles to Dr. Salk for the Salk polio vaccine in the 1960s because of this manifest contribution where mothers no longer had to worry about every time their kid got a little cold that he was going to get polio. So there's that kind of scientist that's kind of dominating the 1930s as well. And some of these films can be quite poignant, like, I don't know if you know Young Tom Edison with Mickey Rooney, which is a very heartbreaking film about what it's like to be a scientific genius among ordinary people, because they will think you are mad. They'll think you're disturbed, you're crazy. So when we watch Young Tom Edison and he's, blowing up things in his basement and his parents don't understand him and, the train conductors are boxing his ears, we know he's going to grow up to be Thomas Edison, but everybody else thinks he's crazy. He's disturbed. He's kind of a proto-little mad scientist.
And I just wanted to say for people who are listening, so you're talking about the kind of spate of films between 1936 and 1943, which actually cover real-life scientists. So on the one hand, you've got Boris Karloff and a whole bunch of other people playing these insane or people who are driven to insanity. And on the other side, you're getting a lot of films coming out which are based on real scientists and how much benefit they've caused for society.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we can move on to the legacy of the mad scientist. Xavier, you talked about the origins. Can you talk about how the mad scientist developed past the 30s and 40s?
I think certainly by the 1950s, that sort of aura of magic that we see in science earlier on in the century has kind of become a bit more mundane. There's obviously a big spate of science fiction horror films again in the 1950s, post Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and I'm thinking of films like Them, for example, and Giant Ants. Even Universal with Creature from the Black Lagoon are trying to sort of rethink their legacy according to these lines. But science, I wouldn't say it has been more domesticated. It has become more part of everyday life. And of course, by the late 1990s, with yet another technological advancement, the sort of Dolly the sheep and the changes to genetics, very specifically, we get yet another wave of these concerns. I'm thinking of films like Jurassic Park, famously, or Gattaca, or Mimic, or what other? Oh, there's even a remake of Island of Dr. Moreau in the 1990s. So again, it's the same old conceits being kind of recycled over and over. I wouldn't say that mad scientist films have ever been particularly positive about their outlook, but what I think we do see is the scientists becoming increasingly morphed or subsumed by the idea of the corporation. I strongly believe that by the time we get to the 21st century, all of these concerns that had been individualized, the mad scientist is mad because whatever, excess of pride. They're not in touch with reality. They've undermined their family or left them behind. Becomes a lot more corporatized, and it's us not being able to look after the world. It's us not being able to get past social inequality, and hence, I like to think of contemporary zombie films as yet another example of a mad science return. But we're already in post-apocalyptic terms, right? We don't think that there is a way out. Sadly, it's all about how we live in a world that we have already destroyed, which brings all sorts of eco-horror concerns that again sort of emerge after the 1970s. 1960s, Silent Spring is a big book in terms of driving forward some of those ideas. So they start merging with science and concerns about climate change more generally, in my view.
Great. Tom, anything to add to that?
Only that I think one of the things that, the mad scientist is up to in the post-war era, and the key film in all this is, I think, 2001, where the monster becomes the computer. And there's, I think, really a break between, previous projections of science, where it might be something like the atomic bomb is what we're afraid of. After 2001, what we're afraid of is the computer. And in fact, we no longer need the mad scientist because we have the super rational entity that is now achieves singularity. He's got consciousness like HAL 9000. And that's particularly threatening to us because, Aristotle said that what defines the human being is his power of rationality. So when the computer achieves singularity and rationality, we're no longer needed. He's better than us. He's like us, and he's better than us, or she, whatever the voice of the computer is. And that becomes, I think, the definitive figure after 2001. It's the cyborg, the computer. So horror doesn't really seem to come anymore from a creature like the mummy. And in science fiction, it's a much more technological tributary now than previously. And it usually, I think, in modern genre studies, is the distinction between fantasy, where anything can happen and there are dragons and magic, and then science, where it actually can happen. Like you can think of a computer taking over the world like Skynet and destroying human beings.
That's actually really interesting, because if you think about the mad scientist and the monsters he creates, there's a kind of a chaos to it all. But actually what we find far more terrifying after 2001: A Space Odyssey is the idea of this completely rational, emotionless monster, which is, to me, and I imagine to a lot of people, far scarier.
Right, and far more difficult to defeat. Like you can basically burn Frankenstein alive and he'll be dead, at least until we need a sequel, where like Skynet is in the clouds. Like how do you get him?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Okay, so the last thing I tend to do in the podcast is I ask both of you for recommendations for the listeners. So where should they go to find out more, or what should they read? Are there any TV series, books, anything that you can kind of pair with the podcast?
Well, Xavier's books, of course, I think would be, one of the obvious places to start. And then I think the other book might be a book that Xavier mentioned, Siegfried Krakauer's From Caligari to Hitler. Because even though it might not seem to be explicitly about mad scientists, it is kind of about horror, and it is a way to interpret films as being about something they don't seem to be on the surface. A projected dream and expression of the dark German soul that in 1933 is going to see fruition in Nazi Germany.
Xavier?
I'm actually going to go with two very recent films that I thought maybe people wouldn't be familiar with. And also, again, maybe to sort of work as a corrective, against the male-centric nature of a lot of these texts. I'm going to recommend a film that, depending on where you live, you might be able to find on Shudder or Amazon Prime, called The Angry Black Girl and Her Monster from 2023, which is probably one of the few mad scientist films that has a teenage black girl as the mad scientist. And it is a really interesting example of trying to retell, again, the Frankenstein story, but this time from a very US, very contemporary, very racialized point of view. It's a film about gang violence. It's a film about racism. So I thought maybe your audience wouldn't necessarily be familiar with it. And since I think you've got quite a few episodes to go before you reach the 2020s, I thought that might be a good one. And the other one, just for pure unadulterated fun, and again, a film directed by a woman, Zelda Williams, and written by a woman, Diablo Cody, Lisa Frankenstein, from 2024, which came out earlier this year. Think Warm Bodies, if you've seen this film, kind of done by Tim Burton, and you'll kind of get a sense of the kind of film it is. So yeah, just so that you end up on a more uplifting note. Mm-hmm. So those would be my two recommendations.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, guys. It's been a wonderful chat. Thank you so much for coming on.
Been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Great. That's it for this episode. If you want the full detailed show notes, you have to head over to the website, which is everyscififilm.com/watch. Go down, choose the episode you want, and then scroll down to the bottom and all the full show notes will be there. I wanted to send out a really big thank you and announce that this podcast has won an award. It won the Best Film History Podcast of 2024, awarded by Earworthy, which reviews many, many podcasts and chose this one. So a huge thank you to them, and a huge, huge thank you for everyone who's listening, and especially those people who've sent such lovely messages of support, either on email or on social media. So thank you to everyone. Now, it's a slightly busy summer ahead of me, so please be prepared for quite a few detours. First of all, I'm taking part in my first ever collaboration with another podcast. That is the Lawhounds podcast. So we will be skipping forward a few decades to 1979 and talking about Alien, which is a spring chicken compared to the films that we've been talking about. Only 45 years old. And apart from that, there is a lost pioneer of science fiction literature from the late 19th century. I will be speaking to two academics about Robert Duncan Milne and why his work got lost and kind of slipped through the cracks, both figuratively and kind of literally. And aside from that, we're heading into the 1940s, which is a bit of a dearth when it comes to science fiction films, but it's a very interesting time in history. So I'm currently doing a bit of research around the war and authoritarianism, which may lead to an episode around those topics. But excitingly, we are then heading into what is known as the golden age of science fiction, the 1950s, and I'm very much looking forward to learning about that. If you want to know what I'm working on and what I'm researching, you can join me on Instagram at Every Sci-Fi Film. That's it for now. Bye-bye.